Simeon said something quite interesting to Miriam in verse 35. He says, yet a sword will pierce through your own soul also. And maybe she did not realize that that may have spoken of the time when she will see her son on the cross. This time had to precede the establishment of the Messianic times. This is why I believe that Yeshua corrects her and says, my hour has not yet come. But in all that, Miriam was a true woman of God and a great, by the way, example for us. By the way, speaking of wine, so many things were said about wine from this passage. And many commentators say that wine at that time was diluted with water. So diluted that they say that it was 3 parts water and 1 part wine. Some even said that it was actually not wine, it was grape juice. In fact, I don't know exactly where they actually take their information. And in fact, when you look at the Old Testament, when people mixed wine with water, it wasn't a good indication. See Isaiah chapter 1, verses 21 to 22. It says, how the faithful city has become a harlot. It was full of justice, righteousness lodged in it. But now murderers, your silver has become dross, and your wine mixed with water. Here we see that the silver and the wine, which used to be valuable, had become worthless. As the wine, it is because it was mixed with water that it became worthless. So wine in itself, by the way, is not a bad thing. But let's remember that it has a double edge. On the one hand, it says that the wine makes the heart merry, right? On the other hand, in Hosea 4:11, it says, harlotly wine and new wine enslaves the heart. Okay? So if you have a problem with wine, just abstain from it. Okay? Let's not take what is happening in John chapter 2 as a license to go and drink wine. Someone actually once asked Warren Wiersbe about the freedom of drinking wine because Jesus turned the water into wine. So he replied, he says, if you use Jesus as your example for drinking, why don't you follow his example in everything else he says? And you won't drink wine. You won't abuse wine, that is. I don't know if you heard how Louis Pasteur pasteurized milk. You know, Louis Pasteur first started to work with wine. He wanted to find a way to get rid of bacteria that caused wine to sour. So the French wine industry got excited and they promised him a big reward. So Pasteur went on to his laboratory and finally developed a process using heat to kill bacteria. The bottled products would last longer, by the way, in the shelf, but the winemakers were not pleased at all. The heating process ruined the taste of the wine, and so his process was useless. But Pasteur took the same process and he applied it to milk, and it worked. It could be pasteurized and then distributed from the countryside, that is, to the city. So by trying to preserve wine, Pasteur unwittingly laid the foundation for the dairy industry. So you see, wine is not that bad after all, right? And there is something else in this passage that is quite striking. I don't want to go too deep into it because it is somehow complicated, but it's worth mentioning. The Gospel of John as a whole was not meant to be chronological. But when it is, there's a message in there. Did you notice that from verse 29, we have some time period that are marked. In verse 29, it starts by the next day. John saw Jesus. So the first day must have begun, that is, in 119, where we have the testimony which John the Baptist made to a delegation from Jerusalem. So this is day 1. And verse 29 is the next day, that is day 2. Then in verse 35 tells us what happened on the following day. This is day 3. The 43rd verse introduces us to the happenings of day 4. Then in 2:1 he brings us to the marriage of Cana of Galilee, to the 3rd day. That is evidently the 3rd day after the last day mentioned. That is, 2 days are omitted here. Why this chronology? What can we see in this chronology. This is where actually it becomes very interesting. By counting all the days, the wedding actually took place on the 7th day. We find Yeshua rejoicing on day 7 at a wedding. It was at the end of the new creation week, if you want. And this has a great theological import. This chronology pictures a full week of work at which end Yeshua is at a wedding. And that may very well typify the works of the Messiah on earth and that great time of the beginning of our union with him in heaven. This time will be marked, by the way, by a wedding also in heaven, if you remember. Let's see what happens in these days and try to correlate them. First, in the Talmud, if you read the Talmud says that most weddings happened on Wednesdays. So we can start with Wednesday as being the last day itself. So the full week gives us a picture, if you want, of the whole work of Yeshua that did for us. Let's see what happened in each day. Thursday, which is day 119 to 129. Verse 29 says the next day, so the first day started at 119. The first day we have the witness of John the Baptist. Since John the Baptist represents the Old Testament, we see here the one that brings out the Old Testament testimony at the beginning of the ministry of Yeshua. This day represents the time of the Old Testament coming into the New Covenant. Then verse 29, it says, the next day John saw Jesus coming towards him and says, behold the Lamb of God. Here we see the appearance of the one promised in the Old Testament. He came to die. And the days, if the days are correct, it was on a Friday, the day of his crucifixion. The lamb is here tied to the crucifixion. Then the next day is a Sunday. Verse 35, it says, again the next day John stood with his 2 disciples. That is a Saturday, that was a Shabbat. And it's interesting that we read that the disciples stayed with him in verse 39 until the 10th hour. The 10th hour is 4 p.m. What happened at the 10th hour in the temple? It was actually the sacrifice of the last lamb of the day, as if the disciples stayed with Jesus until he himself was sacrificed. Sunday in 143, it's day 4. This is the 4th day in the calendar. It falls on a Sunday. The day of the resurrection is quite significant that in the last verse of this passage we are given the passage about the ladder and told that Yeshua had become that ladder. It was a revelation, an interpretation, what we have seen in Exodus. So in 151 it says, more assuredly I say to you, hereafter you shall see heaven open and the angels of God ascending and descending upon the Son of Man. The way was then open. Yeshua had resurrected. Monday and Tuesday, day 5 and 6. What about these days, the 5th and the 6th day? Why don't we have any information about this time? You see, in Jewish marriage system, the time just preceding the wedding is the period of the betrothal. It lasts for at least a year, but it could last for many years. During the period of the preparation, the bride is being prepared, and she prepares herself and fit herself for the coming wedding. The application of the stage of the preparation of the bride of Yeshua, the church, is that the bride is even now in the process of being perfected. One passage that deals with that, of course, is 2 Corinthians 11:2, where he says, I am jealous for you with godly jealousy, for I have betrothed you to one husband, that I may present you as a chaste virgin to Christ. The wedding is about to be consumed soon. So this period of time will typify our preparation period here on earth, a period not known in the Old Testament, not even known at the time of Jesus, but only revealed after Pentecost. And then you have the 7th day, Wednesday. In our week, it is the 7th day, and Wednesday is the day of the marriage, which typify what we see especially in Revelation 19:7. The marriage of the Lamb has come, it says, and his wife has made herself ready. We understand, reading through the scriptures, that the kingdom is often portrayed in terms of banquets, especially a wedding feast. Let me give you some example. In Luke 14, for example, verse 15.